Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by William Taylor. He's an assistant professor and curator of archaeology at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And he's the author of Hoof How Horses Shape Human History, a book published by the University of California Press. I'm very excited of having William here with us. William, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Javier.
Thanks for being with us. And let me ask you first about your background. I listened to the presentation you gave at Stanford in the archaeology seminar a few months ago, and it was a lovely and very entertaining presentation that had a lot of your life there. And you described your connection with horses very interestingly, right? Describing how you grew up in what maybe would be the first generation, no horses, family of a long tradition of horses. Why don't you tell us about that and how you ended up being interested in horses from an archaeology perspective? How that came to your life?
Yeah, so my connection with horses goes back to sort of being a kid growing up in Montana. And I think it's very much true to say that I grew up in a true horse culture, but kind of in a very strange way. I like to think of it as kind of horse culture without the horses. So my own grandfather was born in, I believe, the year 1903. And this guy was a classic Montana rancher cowboy. Unfortunately, he passed away basically right before I was born. But I kind of grew up in this family that we were sort of living in the shadow of this very different era in which, horses, horse culture, horse stuff, kind of a cowboy fascination with horses was all around me. My family, we still sort of the wear the cowboy boots and cowboy hat for special occasions. But my dad became a lawyer, and I grew up kind of caught between these worlds where I have all the cultural, traditions and connections associated with horses, but I didn't really ever, other than a novelty, weekend or two, really ever ride a horse growing up. So, um, as I, became a young scholar and a young scientist, I was, I think, motivated by this towards a curiosity about horses and horse culture. And it just so happened that one of my first opportunities as an archaeology student was to conduct archaeological fieldwork halfway around the world, at least for me, in the steppes of Mongolia. And the first project that I was fortunate enough to work on, one of the first things we did was excavate an ancient horse burial from a culture known as the Pazyryk culture, about 2,500 years old or thereabouts. And at the same time, I was kind of parachuted into a living horse culture too, right? 8-10 weeks in Mongolia, didn't really speak the language, and spending time with my fellow archaeologists, Mongolian guys and gals that are true horse people, that that had a very different and a very living connection with horses. It's like borrow the horse from the local herder and ride it around for fun in the evenings and this kind of things. And it the two kind of parallels here, beginning to study ancient horses in a true sense of discovery and curiosity about these, what felt like a thread linking back to my own family history there in terms of global horse culture. And then also at the same time developing my own actual connection with horses primarily in the steppes of Mongolia, where I started to learn about horses, spend time around horses, ride horses, and kind of develop a connection of my own that I think was kind of, in many ways, conspicuously absent from my childhood. So those are the experiences that kind of motivated me towards a curiosity and kind of a archaeological scientific focus on horses through my graduate studies and my professional career, and kind of the footing, the foundation behind the book too.
I want to ask you more about your work on horses because it's fascinating. The book you wrote, like it honestly changed a lot of the preconceptions I had about antiquity. So and everything based on the horses. So it's like for me it's a big deal. So I'm very eager to hear more about that. But before that, I want to hear about your role as a curator. It's not a very common type of job. What does that entail, and what's a daily a usual day for you as a curator?
So if somebody ever tells you that they're a museum curator, you can immediately assume that they are extremely busy and they probably have about 5 different jobs. For some people, that might be a little bit of a burden. For the most part, um, it, these are it means that my life is uh, filled with lots of different interesting things happening at any given moment. Some of the things that we do are not that different from being for me at least, at a university museum. I teach classes, I supervise students, I do research like a normal professor. But in the museum world, it means also that like a fair amount of my time is helping to take care of our archaeological collections in the museum. That means, I supervise a staff of folks that are working on our archives or collections, rehousing things, cataloging them, databasing them, sharing them with researchers who want to visit our museum and study the past. It also means I get to talk to 8-year-olds, right? Who want to come in and learn what is archaeology, or come look at animal bones or just learn about the past. So in many ways, that's the most exciting part is, a connective tissue with our community. We get to do educational stuff, outreach and work on exhibits and try to tell stories. So I think those parts of my job are maybe a little bit more unique and they're really, really fun. Ultimately it's curator is wearing many different hats at once, but it mostly just means cultivating and caring for our connection with the past, in kind of a community responsibility sense. So I quite enjoy it.
Let's get into the book then and horses. Why don't we start with the evolution of horses? There's a very long history of horses, and you start with the very, very beginning. I want to hear about that story. Where do horses come from? And I also want to hear about what makes this probably raises the question, but what makes a horse, and how is it different from other species? This is going to be important in your whole argument, right? So, what, how is different a horse from a zebra, for instance, right? They look pretty similar, right? It's probably not just the color of the skin.
Yeah. So I think, one of the reasons I start with this topic in the book is I think the evolution of the horse itself has carried a tremendous impact on our relationship with horses as humans, right? And ultimately on human history, human society. So horses, depending on what you call a horse, their history, might go back as far as like the extinction of the dinosaurs, 50, 60 million years ago. Ultimately, what we recognize a lot of as the sort of defining aspects of being a horse, I think are connections to grasslands. If we go back in time, 30, 40 million years ago, we don't really have environments around the world that we would recognize as true grasslands. And along the last 25, 30 million years, we started to have these new habitats that were open sort of oceans of these kind of almost monotonous communities of plants, right? And made out of this very tough, unique plant and material here, grass, which in English we call these blades. They are rigid. We've got lots of cellulose and silica. They're tough to chew, tough to digest, but more importantly, it's just sort of out there in the wide open, right? And so animals that evolved to live in these environments had to deal with all sorts of extraordinary challenges that ultimately started to define and make horses into, I think, what we recognize as the key traits today, being big and strong and fast to escape predators, right? That's a key one. Ultimately, some of the most influential and important things that horses developed to live in the grassland beyond the mechanical and the logistical, a digestive system and teeth that can handle these, are really social and communicative aspects. So horses are extraordinarily gifted communicators. People that do clinical tests with domestic animals would sort of rank them at or near the top, with the only maybe exception being the dog sometimes, in terms of their ability to read human, gestures and expressions and communications. This is related to their complex communication systems that they evolved and developed to survive in the grasslands. Now, in terms of what makes horses different from some of their close relatives, um, the relatives of a horse, a zebra, the asses, the donkeys, they're actually all quite similar to horses on a lot of these major points. In many ways, the most obvious one is they kind of adapted to these cool, temperate grasslands, right? And so the environments that they really thrive in are different. That's an important one. I also think, that while equids have had any number of social organizations, right? There's some that are very independent, some that have very flexible or, sort of fission fusion way of socializing. Horses are really, I think, among the relatives that made it into the modern era. They are the friendliest. They are the most cooperative. They have perhaps the most complex social structures, and I do think that defined ultimately their relationship with humans when we start to think about things like domestication and stuff later on in the story.
When we talk about that, then about and this well way before domestication, but the earliest interactions between humans and horses, and most of this is going to be horses being praised of humans, and there I'm particularly curious about why horses didn't go extinct as many of the other species of what were large or megafauna of the Ice Age, for instance.
Yeah, so as you hit, horses are really fundamentally an Ice Age megafauna, right? They kind of evolved during periods of isolation here on the kind of steppes of North America below the ice sheets, and spread into during periods of connectivity across Beringia, across the sort of isthmus there into South America. They spread into other continents from that fundamental kind of North American homeland, and over the last sort of 3 million years, right, with some different pulses of back and forth, probably the animals that we recognize as closest related to domestic horses today, more like 1 million years, right? But essentially they developed in that kind of Ice Age environment. Now, our human ancestors also sort of developed in a kind of particular corner of the world, and in the last 3 million years have spread to every corner. And it was these kind of Ice Age dispersals, early human ancestors out of Africa and horses out of North America, that brought ancestral humans and ancestral horses into contact for the first time. We have a hard time, very like toxic corner of academia, trying to figure out exactly, what the subsistence patterns were of early, hominins and that sort of thing, whether it was all scavenging or hunting. What we do know is that the first kind of co-occurrence of a human and a horse might date back around, almost 2 million years ago. I think the date might be like around 1.8, kind of probably happening there in around Western Asia, where you get hominins coming into kind of the cool grassland zone of ancient horses. And we know from archaeological sites at higher latitudes that from a very early age, people were interacting with horses. Now, there are some sites that are almost quite literally a smoking gun. My favorite here is the site of Schöningen in Germany that I think it was recently redated, and they now think is associated with Neanderthals, right? But, hundreds of thousands of years old, in which actual weaponry, these incredible wooden spears, were actually fossilized in kind of a unique lakeshore environment where it seems that these ancient hominins had conducted a very sophisticated and successful little hunt. You imagine trying to chase down a horse, right? It doesn't really work out very well in terms of a one-on-one open. I mean, that's kind of their whole deal. But by this time, folks had developed a sense of horse ecology, right? Where do horses like to spend their time? Where can we find them predictably, maybe ambush them, or in this case, probably coordinate to kind of trap them against the water side, right? Where we're using things like early weaponry to kind of hunt these horses. So it's an ancient connection here to between human ancestors and horses that very quickly turns into things like evidence for horse bones being used for tools, right? Butchery and exploitation of different parts of the horse for different things. And by the time we have early Homo sapiens in horse country, 40 plus thousand years ago, horses become not only one of the top, if not the top, source of sort of human dietary inputs, at least in terms of if you're counting bones or something like that, in high latitudes, Europe and Asia. But they also are the number one most depicted animal in things like Paleolithic cave art, cave paintings, incredible sort of bone and ivory carvings. And we start to see that the horse is connecting into when we recognize behaviors or things that we might find to be uniquely human. Artwork, ceremony, belief, right? That horses are linked in there. So they're really, I think, a case could be made for our most ancient prey animal, and certainly the animal with the deepest threads connecting back to human culture, right? So all of these things are sort of the context that presages our connection in terms of domestication.
So domestication, what was the traditional set of explanations? You bring several of them in the book, and you spend quite a bit of time talking about the Yamnaya hypothesis, for instance. So why don't you tell us what are these classic models? Then I'm going to ask you the evidence behind that, and then I'm going to ask you what was wrong with it. But first, what was the understanding we had about when, why, and how we domesticated horses?
So tracing the origins of horse domestication has been a focus of scholars, essentially from the very beginning. It's obvious that this is like one of the most transformative things that's happened in human history. We want to know when and where. And folks have been looking at this from every angle for a very long time. So there's a million different theories for horse domestication. And of course, almost every corner of the world has their own story in which perhaps they also domesticated the horse, or they domesticated it first, or they did it twice, or, so I'm going to skip past a lot of those different theories. And I should say, this is one of the most ongoing corners of science today. It is still a rapidly changing world of new discoveries and, debates and arguments and discussions. So it's an exciting corner of science. And, but it's one that there have been some ideas here that have been around for a very long time, and have taken a kind of a deep root in popular culture or in science beyond archaeology. Probably the most influential of these is an idea often called the Kurgan hypothesis, or as you mentioned, sometimes associated with the word Yamnaya or Yamna. And this idea here starts from the world in which we didn't have a lot of direct material indicators of how can you trace a changed relationship between a human and a horse, neither of which are alive anymore, and without things like historic records or direct depictions that make the case a little bit more obvious. So folks for a long time have pointed to some important changes in material culture that occur and kind of radiate outwards out of kind of the Eastern Europe, Western Asia boundary, right? The kind of edge between Europe and Asia that we might recognize today as, the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, kind of Western Russia, Ukraine. It's still obviously a place of transition and contention today in terms of geopolitics, right? But archaeologists for a long time have recognized that major cultural things happened in this area over the last 4 to 6,000 years, or sometimes the chronology has extended beyond that. And the idea here in particular is that things like burial mounds, right? Mounded sort of tumuli. You'll often hear the word kurgan, right? This is what we recognize in later centuries, like the one that I excavated 2,500 years ago in Mongolia, right? As like a staple of horse culture, right? Building a big burial mound out in the open steppes. This is one of those cultural patterns that emerges and spreads across the continent, sometime around 5,000 years ago, and appears to be linked to things like some ceramic styles, right? To a particular culture, and even, to particular migrations of humans. We've seen this now through things like human DNA. People definitely spread from this corner of the world into Central Europe. They spread eastward a tremendously long ways, as far away as southern Siberia, or even we've identified instances that have a thread connecting back to Yamnaya culture in central Mongolia at 5,000 years ago, right? So really incredible movements of people and material cultural changes that I think for a long time have been a focus of, hey, maybe these are the kind of impressive things, movement of people, big mounds that we might associate with transformations linked to horse domestication. So that's kind of the footing, the starting point for those ideas.
What's wrong with those theories? And what's the evidence that has allowed you to identify those things, right? And there I want to ask you to give us some insights of what you describe as being known as archaeozoology, right? What's that, and how have those methods and sources, because also it's not just about new methods looking at the same sources, but exploring other sites, to have changed the way we think about the domestication of horses.
Yeah. So this has from the beginning been a pretty plausible and exciting and interesting idea, but it's been one that's been built out of kind of indirect connections, right? It's like the fifth or sixth dominoes that we would associate with something like horse domestication, and it's not built from the ground up with evidence, because what is the evidence that you're going to be able to find for someone riding a horse 5,000 years ago, right? It's kind of filling the gap with what we could find. And I think a plausible and interesting place to start for our investigation of the past. But over the last few decades, as you mentioned, we've started to see the emergence of some almost magically powerful tools for actually building a kind of evidentiary understanding of something as invisible as a interaction between a human and a horse through the emergence of this discipline of archaeozoology, right? And archaeozoology in general just refers to the scientific study of animal bones from archaeological sites. But in the case of horses, we began to understand that the lived experience of an animal itself, right? That animal's life, its activities, its repeated actions, its health care, all of these things are sort of shaping, biologically shaping the skeleton of an animal, both for people and for horses, right? And if we know what to look for, and we have developed a kind of toolkit for investigating these things, the recognition that the skeleton itself is actually a chronicle of behaviors and interactions, I think has sort of unlocked our ability to explore these relationships in the ancient world in a much more empirical way, right? This started off kind of the first exciting find was, hey, maybe when we use a piece of equipment to control a horse that we would call a bit, right? Maybe the mechanical movements of that thing in an animal's mouth might actually impact the teeth, right? But it's moved beyond that into recognition that uh, you know, a rider sitting on an animal's back over and over again will sort of cause particular skeletal changes to the animal's back, right? It's turned into a sense that an animal that has been, running heavily exerted throughout their life, whether that's uh, a racehorse or what have you, develop actually skeletal features that tell you that was happening, right? Or an animal that's been confined with a certain kind of posture or constraint might have different little changes to the bony structure of their neck. Or each of these tools that have built up over the years gives us a way to actually assess and trace lived experience. And all of our listeners here will probably already know this, right? If you played a particular sport, dad's got a bad knee, or you have, if you're like me and you write a lot of emails, right, you probably occasionally feel it in the lower back down here, right? Or if you have a particular unique hobby, there's almost certainly a mechanical repetition of that you could feel or point to in your joints or your bones. And so this same principle is very much true in our understanding of ancient animals and ancient people. And in the case of something like trying to trace the origins of horse riding, it's an extraordinarily powerful tool, right? And so over the years, we've learned that we can identify unique types of horse equipment. We can distinguish a nose ring from a early bridle, a bridle with a nose band or a particular kind of mouthpiece. We can distinguish a horse that was pulling a cart with relying heavily on its shoulders, or having a rider without a saddle kind of bumping into its mid back, right? And this toolkit, I think, has really unlocked our ability to test these theories like the Yamnaya. At the same time, this discipline has seen the emergence of biomolecular tools, right? The ability to, it's hard to believe this, but 25 years ago, we were talking about sequencing like one human genome. Now, if I give you a tooth of a horse and a couple months and a couple $100, I can give back you the genome of an individual animal, and we can learn about, what color was that animal's coat? Which ones was it closely related to? I can radiocarbon date and tell you exactly how many years ago it died. I can use stable isotopes to tell you what it was eating. And we have tools now that can take like a scraping from a bit of human tooth and tell you the proteins, the milk proteins that were in that human's diet, whether they were horse or goat or sheep or cattle. And so this incredible toolkit has kind of paralleled the emergence of these two things, have given us this almost overwhelming amount of information about the past. And as these pieces have started to fall into place, I think they've shown us that some of the core assumptions here about the Yamnaya, while they were reasonable inferences and they were built on real and important things like changes in human culture or migrations, that they're not actually linked to horses. We don't have evidence for horse transport of this archaeozoological kind from the Yamnaya culture. We, in fact, if you follow the lineages of the horses that are alive today, as far back in the past as you go, they kind of stop about 1,000 years before we get to, this Yamnaya culture. And so they've given us a way to sort of fact find and trace the origins of horse domestication that have told us that generally the folks were sniffing in the right place, right? Our earliest threads of horse domestication seem to point us towards still this region kind of north of the Black and Caspian Seas, kind of the edges of Europe and Asia. They just point us to about 1,000 years after, this Yamnaya culture. And so we're beginning to be able to interrogate the processes of horse domestication at a higher resolution now than ever before because of these new tools.
Let's talk about that, because it feels to me as a quite radical conclusion, just changing the timing by such a long period of time of the earliest cases of domestication. And there's something particularly interesting about that conclusion, which is that you bring many of the technological innovations that not only, the scholarship, but also the popular culture and the intuition would feed after the domestication, such as the development of carts and carrots and so on, before the domestication, right? So why don't you tell us more about that, right? About how the domestication of horses interacted in a non-trivial way with what in economics we would call innovation, capital, intensification. How was that process?
Yeah, I think this was in many ways the most important implication of this revised timeline for horse domestication. When we think about animal domestication as academics, we're often tempted to kind of go into a sort of video game space with like an ancient band of people and an ancient band of horses, and what enticements or interactions happened in this kind of stripped from time and space. And when we put horse domestication at the time that new evidence is pointing towards, sometime not super long prior necessarily to 2000 BC. What this means now is we have a time and a place that means something to the why and how horses were domesticated. It means that horses were not the first animal used for transport. They were not even the second and not even the third animal used for transport. And if we zoom out, what I try to do in Hoofbeats here is zoom out a little bit about what's happening in Western Asia and Eastern Europe prior to 2000 BC. And the answer is a whole heck of a lot of changing interactions between people and domestic animals. So, sometime in the 4th millennium BC, you've got domestic cattle being used for first agricultural labor, and then we've got vehicles, right? You have innovations of things like cattle-drawn wagons. I don't mean to be too dramatic about it, but the invention of the wheel is this extraordinary moment that apparently has nothing to do with horses, and it turns the societies of Western Asia onto this path of incredible experimentation technologically. People stop using cattle just to plow their fields, and all of a sudden you've got cattle-drawn carts, right? They can be used for trade. They can be used for battle, right? As silly as that sounds, like cattle-drawn battle wagons, these were a real thing. And they start to influence how people were able to use domestic animals. I think when I look at now what this means and the archaeological record of something like Yamnaya, why did people all of a sudden move into the cold grasslands of Mongolia at 3000 BC from halfway across the continent? If it wasn't horses, Well, they had cattle and they had wagons. And it looks to me like that first step of animal transport kind of unlock a way of moving around the landscape with your animals that is not just farming, it's not just hunting, right? It opening up a kind of a pastoral life way for the steppes, right? And again, before horses ever show up. We see that now that this means donkeys were probably the first equid to be domesticated, and our story is now pinballing us down to the Nile corridor in Egypt, right? Where again, agricultural labor appears to be the motivating force here, but very soon donkeys have been traded up to the Near East, right? You're finding donkeys in the Levant. Cattle-drawn wagons are now being adapted for donkeys. And you have a period of time where folks are shifting their technology to make it a little lighter, right? Donkeys obviously not quite as strong as cattle, but they're faster. And I think one of the more extraordinary finds of the last, 5 years has been the DNA analysis of some of the equids that were pulling carts of the Middle East in the 3rd millennium BC, and finding out, just as some folks had guessed for decades, some of these are actually hybrids between donkey and the Syrian wild ass, or what you might call an onager, right? People began to try to, experiment, make their sad little donkey carts faster with animals that they could still engage with and control and manage behaviorally, right? And all of this stuff was happening for centuries before the first interaction with horse transport that we see in the archaeological record. And it was connected with technology, right? We had initially, some very simple mechanisms of control for these donkeys and cattle, just kind of a nose ring and a line, right? And I think this changing technological system, by the time, by the circa 2000 BC, we've gone from heavy, simple plows and wagons into very light carts being pulled by donkeys and other equids that look a lot like a chariot, right? Folks were riding donkeys. They were using animals in creative and unique ways, and they were experimenting with the technology. And this is just across the Caucasus Mountains, from where our very first engagement between people and horses for transport would ultimately emerge. I think this helps us understand why it was here at the margins of Europe and Asia rather than Mongolia or central Kazakhstan or, these open, wide grasslands where horses might have first been brought into the fold in terms of transport. So it's an interesting question, right? Why is it that when all of these animals, not just horses, but all these animals really show up as a transport animal, it's paired with all this technology, right? It's not just the idea of, yeehaw, I'm going to hop on a horse, but it's like this, what would intuitively seem much more complex situation, right? I got to build a cart. I've got a team of animals here, and I'm, a whole lot of effort and energy into all this technological framing for something like a two-wheeled chariot, which is what we see the very first domestic horses in, which are burials where there's two horses and a chariot, right? It seems a little counterintuitive as the origins of horse transport. But when you look at this broader trajectory, it actually starts to make a lot of sense. Getting on the back of a large, fast animal and sort of holding on for dear life is a sort of a poor idea logistically, right? These are animals that have literally evolved to get away from us, right? We were their, ancient predator going back, hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And these technologies were designed iteratively to improve our ability to control animals in transport. When horses first appear, there are two key technologies that are apparently involved in allowing them to be used for transport. The first is the bridle with a mouthpiece or a bit. This did not, I can't say it clearly enough, this did not exist before the first horse transport. You can't point to any indication that this technology of a system where you had a noseband, something going through the mouths, it is designed uniquely to control the horse. And I think before that, we would have just had these lip or nose rings that mechanically do not have that ability to communicate with sophistication or urgency. Horses were also paired with the first invention of the spoked wheel, something that is light enough to handle the high speeds and strong enough to not rattle to pieces. But it's not as though the first folks using chariots didn't know about getting on the back of an animal, or probably didn't even do that sometimes. Almost certainly they did, right? I think what we see in the archaeological record is people representing the form of transport that was being used for things like battle, right? Prestige. And ultimately, early animal transport was quite sloppy and incomplete and kind of a negotiation, right? These first horses might have been a lot like trying to ride a zebra, right? Kind of a violent, dangerous, evasive animal. And one anecdote I like to think of when I explain this to folks is, back in the day when we used to have these overland carriages that went from St. Louis, Missouri to Sacramento, California, you'd have these people that have to go this tremendous distance as far and as fast as they could. And they might have a team of 6 or 8 animals there. When you've got the structure of a big vehicle, a big harness, a yoke, all these things, they would actually take wild horses and strap them in there and go, right? With hardly any training, as long as they kind of were willing to take a little bit of risk. They found it fun. It will get them there faster. The animals were crazier. There's even an anecdote of people putting bison inside some of these things and saying, "Yeehaw, here we go, giddy up," right? You can't do that with mounted riding. It's dangerous. It will kill you, right? To hold on to an animal's back in the most vulnerable part of their anatomy where they can't see you, and get them to do what you want in a way that's safe, is a different story than being able to control them in a team, in a structure, and this sort of thing. And we saw the archaeological record shows us an ever expanding role for riding as technology and control improves over the centuries. So almost certainly the first folks to domesticate a horse would sometimes ride it. We don't know a lot about exactly when or why, but by the time we have historic records that point to it, by 1700 BC, and suggest that it was a dangerous, risky activity, that it was a sometimes thing, right? And so I think that's a long-winded answer, but that's my take on those processes.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, in so many levels, right? And on one hand, it's super interesting to see how your discipline studies this phenomena from such an intuitive perspective, right? Like very tangible observation of processes, right? Or reflection of processes. But it's also quite interesting, the implications of this conclusion to the history of innovation, right? It's as an economic historian, we frequently like to think that there's this thing that people call pre-modern technology, sort of like there's a certain way of doing things before modernity, and those things had been there pretty much since antiquity, and horses are the key productive feature of it. And of course there's some awareness of innovations in metallurgy and sailing and things like that, right? So we're not like so ignorant about antiquity, but in regular daily productive activities, we have the sense that since early states, we've had pretty much the same type of technology, right? And horses were there. And what you're saying is, no, this is actually not really the case. The period you're describing is one when we already are having fairly large, complex societies, and at least the Levant and Egypt and Mesopotamia and so on. So it really makes us aware that there was a pretty fast pace of innovation, and what you're describing is literally that, right? So it's a very dynamic process of societies adapting to new things and importing goods and knowledge from fairly far away, and again in fairly short periods of time, right? So this is not a very long process, and that of knowledge that is being transmitted probably from just people migrating, there's certainly something about knowledge diffusing much faster than what we would understand as regular just movements of people. So I think that's fascinating. And I would like then to connect that very dynamic innovation environment that this lays out with, I guess, the institutional innovations and transformations that the domestication of horses allow, right? And in particular, the role of horses in the army and as a military tool. How transformational was this? And again, when do we start to see and how do we observe the role of what is going to be the key military advantage for many centuries afterwards?
Yeah, I think you're spot on a lot of points. And for me, I think the perhaps the most influential consideration of horses in the way that they shaped human history, geopolitics, all of these things is that they are both this extraordinary innovation as a way of getting around, right? And there were technologies involved in that. They are themselves, sort of an inspiration, uh, change to the way you move. They immediately present you with this extraordinary, physical dominance. And we see it playing out still today. All you have to do is look at a video of a protest in LA, or there's conflicts all over the globe now where the physical strength and speed, an advantage given to somebody with horsepower is immediately obvious and apparent, right? But at the same time, they are an animal. Horses are an animal, and there are places that horses do well, and there are places that you will have a very hard time raising a horse and keeping a horse healthy, or having a large herd of horses, or getting a horse to reproduce. And the logic of this, I think, immediately became clear in the ancient world. Horses are not only indispensable to maintaining your authority all across the ancient world, where, at least in the places horses spread to, if in the past you were able to maintain your, grip on power through a little bit of religion and showmanship and control over your crops, or, I'm simplifying all of world history here, but all of a sudden you needed horses to do it. And we saw a very, very extraordinarily rapid toppling of the systems of power across Eurasia and even northeastern Africa, Egypt, right? Within, 500-600 years, you had civilizations like, Greece, Egypt, Indus Valley, all sort of struck down by the chaos of, the sort of incursion of folks that had horses and you didn't, right? Um, and in order to rebuild your power structures here, you now needed to raise horses yourself or connect with, the grasslands through trade. And I think it would be no exaggeration to say that, like, the open, cold grasslands of a place like Mongolia, where I spend most of my, research time, there was a long stretch of human history where, like, it was a place you went sometimes, right? Rather than all the time. Or at the very least, it didn't have huge, dense urban conglomerates of people from all corners of the world. Horse domestication now placed these areas front and center. This is where you had to go in order to encounter large numbers of horses. The people who lived here now had this extraordinary sort of forcefulness, gravitational pull to not just to their military power, but sort of their economic and cultural influence. And this is the thing that horses would play out everywhere they went, everywhere else in the world for the rest of time, right? Horses are introduced, into kind of West Africa. All of a sudden, it's like, where could you raise horses that are still kind of, grasslandy enough, and they're not going to have high parasite loads? These areas became empires, right? And horses introduced into North and South America, and you ended up with continental trade networks and polities that you could reasonably argue were empires, like, Comanche and Lakota, territorial sovereign areas of both continents that were not just wealthy, but had this kind of gravitational center to them focused on the grasslands, right? Um, one anecdote that I think I like to encourage folks who are looking for a fun distraction. Look for the diary, the travels of Marco Polo, right? We think of Marco Polo sometimes in popular culture as this big adventurer to the steppes, right? A big explorer. But if you read the first chapter or two of his diary, you will see that the man really had no intention of going to the court of Kublai Khan, right? He was a little, Venetian merchant trying to do a little bit of trade at the edge of the Black Sea. And he found himself essentially conscripted and relocated across the continent into, the empty, one of what is today one of the least populated areas of the planet, but which, because of horses, was the center of the ancient world. This process began to play out over and over again across the world because of who horses are as an animal and their ecology, where they do well and where their connection with people was easier and more prolific, and would continue this way. So in many ways, I sort of view this as one of the reasons we ended up with a connected and globalized world, right? Our empty grasslands were now a center place, and they were sources of power and connection. And somebody who grew up in an empty grassland, right? That's a meaningful thing to me that I think connects us to the world, even, that we live in today.
That's fascinating. And there are many more pieces of the book that I would love to talk about, because your story doesn't stop there, right? So it's not a story about antiquity. You elaborate on the diffusion of horses and horse culture across the entire world. But I would like to finish this conversation going into the present and thinking about, on the one hand, what's left of the horse culture and just the implications of, I mean, is this just a story about horses completely disappearing with the arrival of fossil fuel as a source of energy and a core part of the productive system? Or there's some nuances to that story? And that's one question I have for you. And then I have a more speculative question that was all the time in the back of my head while reading the book and listening to you today, regarding the innovation in the scholarship in archaeology and, well, archaeozoology in particular now. And I'm curious about how you have perceived that. So the new methods emerging in the last 20 years, of which you have seen just coming. Um, but how do you anticipate this evolving in the future? I'm very curious to hear from you. What type of research do you think that you would be able to be doing in 20 years, for instance? Um, and also, what limitations do you see in that innovation? What type of things do you what type of methods you would love to have in 20 years, but you're pretty sure that they're not going to be there yet? Then I'm throwing a bunch of things here at you, but help me try to think about how this field is going to change in the coming years.
Yeah. Well, so to answer your first question, I think there often is this sort of implied end to the horse story, right? Oh, everybody drives a gasoline car now, or now electric vehicles, and this is kind of a nostalgic look at the world that was. I really don't think that's the case, and my answer to this changes, every month, that I think or talk about these things. There are many aspects of the human horse connection that I think folks have realized have sort of been lost, or at least displaced from the mechanization and industrialization of the last 200 years. And one of those that's actually growing is the role of horses in social connection. A lot of my native collaborators are leaning hard into the role of horses in things like ceremony or youth programming. Horse racing has had a resurgence in some cultures and contexts. But in fact, even if you even follow the population trends of horses in in this country, for example, over the 20th century. If you stopped at like 1970, you might think, horses are done for, right? As a part of daily life. And in fact, in recent years, that populations have started to tick back up, right? And horses are becoming, quite popular in for applications, not just for like an equestrian weekend, but especially things like equine assisted therapy, I think are actually growing in certain ways. So culturally, horses have a lot of role left to play. There are obviously certain corners of the world, Mongolia, one of them, lots of the areas of the American West where horses still do their kind of fulfill their timeless role as livestock and means of getting around and these sorts of things. But perhaps a bit more troublingly, I think as we start to consider a world in which the global order is shifting and we're seeing conflict, I think we don't have to look far to remind ourselves that horses play a lot of those same roles in things like power and conflict today too. Both horses and donkeys have started to show up as we enter, multiple years of a horrific grinding war at the edges of Europe. We're finding, you see headlines there about equids being involved in conflict in places like Sudan or Ukraine or some of these things too. So I don't think we can quite close the book on those aspects of the story either. And we should remind ourselves that there are millions of horses around the world, and they are one of the more successful creatures of our modern era. So I think there are many chapters yet to unfold about the human horse story, whatever they may be. Now, about your question about technology, I've also given you kind of a progress narrative about archaeozoology. It is extraordinary, the tools that we have at our disposal. But when we try to investigate the past, we are using extraordinary tools and applying them to unbelievably fragmented sets of data, right? We might often have one or two little snippets of insight into a particular time or place. And most of our important discoveries that lie ahead of us still have to do with more, old school archaeology. We need people to be doing archaeological field work, right? To be doing excavations and survey and analyses and revisiting museum collections. And I think we have a problem, a contradiction happening, which is that as our technology is improving, I think we have a high threat of losing basic funding for basic science. So I worry that there is more of a risk of what you might call armchair archaeology, right? Somebody who has a genetics lab and can sequence 500 specimens, might still get interesting research and scholarship done, but it's not paired with, putting your hands on the material culture of the, ancient steppes, because some of this stuff is a little more painful. It requires shovel and trowel, right? And pen and paper. And the true discoveries that we have to make, I think, are a merger of, classic just investigation into the past with these new tools. And I think there's a lot, if we can do that, I worry about the funding for science and the erosion of, grants and infrastructure for things like museums and archaeological fieldwork. But if we can emerge out of this with a pairing of new technologies with more data about the past, there are some incredible things that lie ahead. Things like DNA and proteomics. They're starting to be able to reconstruct the genome, not just of the animals, but of their microbiome, right? You're starting to be able to trace things like ancient diseases, right? Or even the different aspects of the living sort of history of a single individual through their biomolecules. If you compare that with more nuance and detail about their material culture and their skeleton, I think one of the things, just as an example of this, so I'm not rambling, we're trying to start a new project here where we look at in great detail the skeletal changes to human riders and to the horses that they were riding, right? Together as a how do they respond to new technologies like the saddle and the stirrup? Are there subtle differences, in the skeletal changes that you can see in a single individual around little shifts in how they were controlled, right? And imagine pairing that with DNA tools that'll tell you with greater certainty, what did the horse look like? What were its attributes and traits, or what was even the non-DNA, you know, community, the microbes or the diseases and these things that were a part of their life. I think we could learn extraordinary things, scientifically grounded things about how our relationship with horses helped our, history, our society, change and move and evolve over the centuries. So I'm excited about all these potential, the way that technology might unlock new questions. I worry about the value of those technologies if they're not paired with, more excavations and museum research and just old-fashioned archaeology. I think that's where their greatest power comes from, the connection of those two things.
That's a great that's probably a great way of ending this conversation, right? With a cautious but optimistic view of the future of archaeology. Thanks a lot. This was a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot from this and from reading the book. I honestly recommend everyone to take a look at the book. It's a fantastic story about something that seems so prevalent that we don't really take the care to reflect more carefully, and it's going to change for most people the view they see a good chunk of human history. So thanks a lot, William, for taking time to chat with us and for writing such an interesting book.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope you all enjoy the book.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.